Is this working? Good. Okay. How can marketing increase brand value? I was actually half asleep then because I was thinking about my flight back. I'm going on an Estonian Air and wondering whether I should expect any kind of service like that on the flight home. Before you actually understand how marketing affects business value, I think you need to understand something about business value itself. So I'll start by showing you a study that Brand Finance has been conducting for the last 10 years, where we look at all major stock markets in the world, we record the values of all those quoted companies, and then we look at their balance sheets to look at the value of tangible assets, that's things like plant, equipment and buildings, compared with intangible assets. And then we look at the way that they are split. So at the last count, at the end of 2010, I think this was, 80 leading stock markets, we aggregated them all, virtually 100% of world quoted companies. There are about 50,000 of them, and there's $60 trillion, nice big number for you to start after lunch, $60 trillion of what they call enterprise value, which is the money that's attributable to the shareholders and the long-term providers of capital for those businesses. Now, if you look at the assets represented by all that finance, you see that at the last count, 42% of it was tangible and 58% of it was intangible assets. We estimate that within that last number, approximately 10 trillion, probably the single largest line of item, is made up of brands and marketing intangibles. So it puts it in a global context. Now, if you actually look at the trend over the last 10 years, you can see that values of enterprises have marched upwards at least till the end of 2007. They then fell off a cliff and went back up again. Now, we're almost back to where we were before, but it's not quite there, but it's almost there. And you can see that there's a great deal of stability in the value of the tangible assets. They're pretty easy to value, and they're pretty easy to just get from the balance sheet and pretty well know that that's what they're worth. The hard bit is understanding the intangible value of companies and how that drives forward the value. And I think to some extent this chart shows the confusion of investors who don't necessarily really understand the value of the intangibles in the businesses they're looking at, nor do they understand the brands. And that's why Brand Finance for the last 15 years has been trying to bridge the gap between marketing and finance, trying to help explain that difference and maximize the difference. Now you'll see that there are 4 colours there. The grey is tangible assets straight out of the balance sheet. The light grey is disclosed intangible assets that arise at the point where somebody makes an acquisition. And then the red is goodwill. And what that means is when you make an acquisition for 100, if let's say 50 of it is tangible assets and you've got 50 left over, it's incumbent on we accountants to split that between specific intangible assets that have been acquired and just a general difference in price. And so you can see that over the years, the number in there has been growing because more and more acquisitions have happened. You should be aware that amongst accountants, you are only allowed to put the value of these intangibles into your balance sheet at the point where you actually make an acquisition. So everything from the red line downwards is actually in the balance sheet of those companies that you could get from their finance director. The other bit, the green bit, is the extra value attributed to those companies by investors in the market. So it's out there in the market, which is why we call it undisclosed. You won't find it in the balance sheet, you find it in the markets. And so just to show you how that trend has fluctuated over the years, it's been around about 50% for about the last 10 years. But as you can see, it fluctuated wildly. And that's why there needs to be much greater understanding between finance and marketing people to make sure that we more correctly value these things. Now, with accountants, what they tend to do, when an acquisition has happened, which I just told you, they are only then allowed to put intangible assets into balance sheets. At that point, they have to define all the assets that a company owns, and you can see there they've got tangibles, which are things like working capital, plant, land and buildings, so on. That's easy. The bit above, they tend to characterize into those blocks of intangibles. So you get things like technology intangibles, which are patents, software and so on. You get things like contract intangibles, which are things like telecom spectrum rights, where you pay to get the right to use the spectrum. And of course, within there are marketing intangibles, which are brand. So brand and marketing intangibles are one classification, albeit one of the biggest classifications of intangibles. And what accountants do on an acquisition is they break the company up to neat little parcels to put it into the balance sheet. Now, the point that I wanted to make is that although we do that at a point in time to put it into the balance sheet, the reality is that intangibles work together to generate the business of the company. And the relationship between them changes over time. So if you look at this conceptual framework here, when you start a company, there's a well-known company in the UK called Dyson, for example. Dyson makes vacuum cleaners, very good vacuum cleaners, and they patented a whole load of technology about 20 years ago. When they started, the Dyson brand name meant nothing. And it was all about the technology and the superior product. But gradually over the years, they've got greater distribution, greater people, they've got customers that are loyal to them, and they're increasingly getting a strong brand. So people will go to them because of their highly coloured, interesting machines, which have been featured in places like Friends, and you see them advertised. They've become a brand in themselves. And now, their original patents are running out, but the brand has got a momentum of its own. And so gradually over a number of years, they work together to generate value and lasting value. And you could cite any number of instances like that. Intel did it with microchips. Shell have done it with a thing called V-Power, where they created a better fuel, branded it. Everyone else is caught up, but it's still a very large proportion of their turnover and very profitable. Gillette do it all the time with a whole load of their brands. So you create technology and you ramp it up with the use of branding. And that's why it's a little bit more subtle than most accountants will credit when they do one of these snapshot valuations at an acquisition. And I think to really understand, you need to get under the skin, or we financial people need to get under the skin of it and work with marketing people to understand how they really work together. So, just perhaps this is a statement of the obvious, but understanding how marketing and branding drive business value, the thing I always start with is to say that before you do anything to understand how branding can drive value, you've actually got to have a very clear business strategy. And there are a number of different things you need in order to be clear about what your business strategy is. You know, you've got to know about your company's heritage, what your customers need, the dynamics of the markets you operate, what the competitors are doing and how strong they are, what your view is of the future, the corporate structure, the financial resources, the personnel resources, and so on. So you have to have a corporate structure, a business strategy. Within that, you can then set the context of your brand strategy, and within that, you set the context of your brand strategy. Now, I say that because if you don't, you can't get internal alignment and clarity to bring all your staff along to deliver the business strategy through the marketing strategy to the brand strategy. Because if you look at a brand promise, it's all about the company saying what it will do in its strategy, the staff having to implement, and it's all being delivered to the customer. If they're not all in alignment, things will go haywire. And I thought I'd just throw up a few companies that we've worked with off and on over the years, not so much ABN AMRO anymore because they've been taken over and split up, but points at which their business strategy, their marketing strategy and their brand strategy were not clear and things begin to go all haywire. So for example, ABN AMRO, its share price suffered dramatically about 5 years before it was taken over, because nobody in the market really understood what their business, marketing or brand strategy was, including the investment analysts. And as a result, they were marked down. And we did quite a bit of work with them, trying to rationalise what it was that the market needed to understand and how you would communicate it with them, so that their share price would rise. But there was a great deal of confusion, both internally and externally, about what they were trying to achieve. They had a network of banks around the world, none of which were in the same brand name, and there wasn't an apparent strategy. British Airways went through a similar period about 15 years ago. You may remember when they put all those multifarious tail fins, nobody knew quite what they were trying to achieve. They were a quintessentially British airline, trying to pretend to be multicultural, not very successfully, caused a whole range of problems. Ericsson had a similar problem where they couldn't decide whether they were an infrastructure or handsets. Everyone thought they were mainly a handset manufacturer, whereas in fact all their profits came from infrastructure. And they subsequently got rid of the handset division. And even Shell, when they had their problems with the upstream division and drilling rights and reserves, they were not entirely clear what their overall strategy was. And it was quite ironic, really, because we were working on a project which they call Project Qi, which means energy in Chinese, that was meant to be looking at the new brand strategy for Shell. And the first question the committee asked was, well, what is the business strategy? And I think someone said, sorry, it's confidential, or words to that effect. So we weren't really even allowed to know what their long-term objectives were. Were they likely to get into coal? Were they likely to get into nuclear? Were they going to divest their downstream retail? Nobody quite knew. So how do you set a brand strategy? Anyway, a few statements that are bleeding obvious about branding. I mean, first of all, clearly a brand is items of recognition and definition, so things to identify from other competitors, and there can be various different things you register. There's a whole range of things you can register with trademarks and copyrights and so on, creating that differentiation in commodity markets. When I say it's a statement of the bleeding obvious, the reason that I say that is because all too often when we go in and look at companies, not only don't they have a clear flow from their business strategy to their marketing strategy, their brand strategy, nor do they have a clear understanding of what the assets are they own in IP terms. And here are just three rather silly examples of where that's the case. On the left-hand side, I noticed that you've just adopted the euro, haven't you, in January. We were asked by the European Commission to help defend them in a court case that was taken about 10 years ago when they first launched the euro, because when they launched the euro, they had forgotten to check whether the trademark was available for that symbol. And in fact, somebody had already registered it. It was registered by Thomas Cook in their foreign exchange business. So the European Commission was not actually allowed to use that trademark, even though they launched it. And Thomas Cook came along and said they wanted compensation, so there was a big argument about that. It got thrown out on a technicality at the end, but it's a classic example of when you're launching a brand, you must know what you own. The one in the middle, Rolls-Royce, the original company sold off their cars division to a company called Vickers. Vickers got tired of it, sold it on to Volkswagen. When Volkswagen paid 450 million euros, I think it was, pounds, I beg your pardon, it was pounds, they thought they were buying the Rolls-Royce brand name and the Bentley brand name and everything else that went with it. But about right at the 11th hour, Rolls-Royce PLC pointed out to them that they didn't really own the Rolls-Royce name. They did own the Bentley name, but the Rolls-Royce name was licensed in to that cars division they just bought. And Rolls-Royce PLC said, we don't want Volkswagen owning our brand. So we'd like it back, thank you very much. We're going to cancel the license. And they took the license back. And then the next day, they sold it to BMW because they said VW's down market, BMW's up market. We'd rather BMW made our cars than VW. And so they sold the trademark alone for £40 million. There was quite a lot of argument about whether the lawyers acting for Volkswagen had done quite the right thing. They obviously didn't do very good due diligence. So a classic example of where it wasn't clear that they owned the IP that their brand was supposedly based on. And then over here on the right-hand side, we did some work on, in fact, my first ever brand valuation was Budvar in Czech, where if you look at those two brands, Budvar has a very spoiling position against Budweiser, the American brand, because in Europe it is deemed to be a product of denominated origin, and they've also registered it in a number of countries as their trademark, so that what was Anheuser-Busch and is now Ambev cannot use the brand in every market. And in fact, we at Brand Finance did an estimation of the amount of uplift we thought there would be to the Budweiser brand, or their brand business, if they were able to use the Budweiser trademark globally with no constraints. And as you can see, it was back in 2005, it would have gone from 49 billion up to 57 billion. So the basic elements of branding are rather important. If you don't get them right, you are destroying value. The other side of it is that once you've got those basic rights, you obviously have to build something into them. You have to build attributes, associations, the psychological stuff that affects people's decision-making process. And obviously what you build into them is functional and emotional attributes that allow distinction between one brand and another, speed the choice, make it easy for people to choose one brand rather than another. The benefit of that is that if you have a functional brand, you will do quite well. You have a business like MBNA used to have before it got taken over, it wasn't really very strong, made some money. In my opinion, MasterCard is a pretty functional brand, it's good at what it does. If you go over onto the other axis where you're looking at emotionality, Amex is very emotional, but not particularly functionally strong. You know, you can't really use it in many places. People are reluctant and they throw it back at you because it's too expensive to be accepted. Whereas in the top right-hand corner, you have Visa, which I think does everything. So you get the functionality and you get the emotional attributes to make powerful brands. Which leads me on to the subject of brand equity. And to some extent, I think this overlaps with what Rory was saying earlier on, where he was saying, I think what you were saying, Rory, was that behaviour comes before attitude. I'm not sure I really agree with that, actually. You may not be able to measure a change in attitude before you see the behaviour, but I certainly think a change in attitude comes first. And I think actually there are ways that you can measure changes in attitude before you see the change in behaviour. And if I didn't say that, I might as well pack up and go home. And I think one of the theses of your presentation, Rory, was that a lot of the work that people do, and by that a lot of the analytical work that we might do, would be an utter waste of time. You just have to intuitively guess what people's behaviour is going to be next. I fundamentally don't really believe that. It may be difficult measuring the changes in attitude that lead to the changes in behaviour, but I think there are ways that you can do it. And what you're trying to do is look at the functional attributes that define a brand, the conduct, the behaviour, the good behaviour, environmental and ethical and so on behaviour, and you're also trying to measure image and emotional attributes, and they are the things which are taken together which determine whether people's attitude to a brand is gradually changing and whether they're then likely to change their behaviour. I think, it's quite clear, to me at least, that there are brands where you can see those different dimensions gradually changing and suddenly buyer behaviour switches. So, for example, if you look at the conduct attribute, a lot of brands have been trying very hard to become environmental. Coca-Cola is a perfect example, trying to demonstrate that they're not spoilers of the environment, wasters of water, and causes of obesity, but in fact they're really socially desirable, good people who save on all those things. They're trying very hard to rectify that, and gradually trying to change attitudes so that they can reinforce the behaviour. So I do think that you can measure it with experimental research. I do think you can see the way people's behaviour changes, and you can track that into the financial performance of the business. And I'd have to say that because what we spend our whole time doing is looking at people's financial results and trying to track it back to say, what actions can you take as brand managers that will influence those attributes that then cause changes in behaviour that affect the financial performance? And I believe you can actually measure that with customers to show how gradually changes in preference and consideration lead to growth in acquisitions, reductions in lapse, increases in money spent and so on. So you can actually see it flowing through into revenues. And equally you can see it on the other stakeholders, the way that they behave to the company. In particular, the way that financial stakeholders behave towards the company. There is no doubt, in my opinion, that if you go and look at your average lender in the City of London or your average investor, they attribute a disproportionately high value to a well-branded company. I mean, naturally, you would expect them to put a high premium on a strongly branded company because logically it's going to perform better in the future. Quite often, you will find that it's slightly irrationally better. It's better than the expectation. So brands clearly affect, in my opinion, all of the major stakeholder groups, and it's our job, first of all, to measure it. Again, I don't agree that you can't measure or shouldn't measure things, nor that you shouldn't have them as targets. I think the reverse. I think you should. And it allows you then to understand what you need to do as brand managers to affect the ultimate outcome. And I'll stop talking about theory and just show you a few examples. Apple, poor old Steve Jobs, but anyway, the interesting thing about them is that the technology behind Apple is not necessarily the best. In fact, very often they don't even have the technology. They bring it in, stick it together, and put all the branded attributes around them in order to excite the public and bring people back. So what they talk about is thinking differently, looking differently. You feel different when you are associated with that brand. But if you look at the development cycle for a thing like the iPod, which was the thing that kicked off their current wave of success, just about none of the technology in there actually came from Apple. And I often go out to Singapore. We've got an office in Singapore. They're always moaning on about the fact that a company called Creative Technologies invented this and that, and there's another Singaporean company that invented thumb drives. Fine, they invented the technology, but they're absolutely rubbish at putting the branding on it. And that is where Apple are so brilliant. They are brilliant at pulling together all these different technological suppliers, paying them a small price, $15 a go, and keeping the difference for themselves. So I think that's a pretty good example, and if you look at the effect on their share price compared with someone like Sony, they have done a brilliant job of taking other people's technology, wrapping it up, selling it at a high premium because they have got that brand loyalty. I'd also like to look at Virgin, which I think sort of encapsulates most lessons you might want to learn about branding. First of all, if you look and talk about brand, one thing you have to think about is that when people talk about brands, they sometimes just mean the little tight group of trademarks, and that tends to be what finance people talk about when they're sticking them into the balance sheet. Tell me what the trademark's worth, I'm going to put them into the balance sheet now that I've just done an acquisition. So there's a technical definition of the trademarks. So quite often they're taken out, put into a trademark or brand holding company, very often in somewhere like Switzerland. So they are a definable group of assets that Philip Kotler defined and that, as John Murphy said, you put value into, but it's just a defined group of intangible assets. And that is deployed in one or more branded business. And in this case, I've used Virgin Atlantic, but I don't suppose anybody here would know that Virgin have got over 300 companies in the world that use the Virgin trademarks. And many of them, they don't actually have an ownership control of, they just license them in. And increasingly they're licensing in rather than owning. So they have a whole mixture of controlled subsidiaries, minority holdings, and just pure licensing deals. So you get a whole range of them, and then within that, it's wrapped into a whole organisation, a holding company. It's very interesting that Virgin nowadays do actually call themselves a private equity company with a brand. Bit of a difference from the early days when they were a record shop down Portobello Road. But they have created significant power behind those trademarks which elicit responses from customers. So, just quoting from good old Richard, brands must not be built around products but around reputation, quality and price. People should not be asking, is this one product too far, but rather, what are the qualities of my company's name? How can I develop them? He also says that at Virgin, we know what the brand name means, and when we put our brand name on something, we're making a promise. It's a promise we've always kept and always will. Harder work keeping promises than making them. No secret formula. As far as he's concerned, Virgin sticks to its principles and keeps its promises. Again, visionary leadership and sticking to what you say you're good at are pretty good reasons for keeping that flow of business strategy, marketing strategy, brand strategy working effectively. And where it comes to actually licensing out from their private equity company with a brand, this is broadly what they say they do. They say, we want to be sure that what we're licensing it into is going to be good, if not the best quality in that market, that it will be highly innovative, good value for money, challenging existing alternatives, and bringing a sense of fun. So it's not only functional, it's also emotional. And so I think I'll show you an example from Virgin Atlantic, which is one application, probably one of the best. If we could just double click on that. Got a video here. Well, I thought I did. Where's it gone? You got a problem? Okay, I mean, to me, that encapsulates everything about what I've just spoken about. The fact that if you're trying to elicit a response from customers, you have to look at functional conduct and image attributes, see whether or not you are superior to the competition. If you're not, work out how you can be, and pull all of the levers, including the emotional one. Secondly, it shows that Richard Branson is a natural at actually getting that right and applying it into different businesses. And, you know, if we're talking here about, people often talk about him as that wacky guy that sort of jumps down buildings and all this kind of stuff. He is now a multi-billionaire, and the way he's done that is by cleverly mixing the ability to create brands and understand how brands leverage business. So how do you make a creative brand with the financial side? You will not find a more savvy financial guy than Richard Branson. And, you know, his team are now looking at a whole range of different things. They quite rationally divest from these businesses when they think they're overvalued. They did it with Virgin Blue. They've divested half of Virgin Atlantic. So they are like merchant bankers with emotion, if you know what I mean. Anyway, the way he did it there was he just said he couldn't stand the identical food service, extortion affairs and so on back in 1984. They launched in 84. He'd never seen the airline sector before. He hired some people from a low-cost airline, which was Laker, said, how should I do it? Straight into his core positioning, being innovative, maverick, fun, but also high quality on the functional side, was profitable almost immediately by the clever way they ran the business, and they gradually eroded BA's market share. BA now looks like a very tired old airline, albeit huge. It's like the Ministry of Branding compared with the entrepreneurial Virgin Atlantic. They put advertising material out against BA. You may not have seen this, but you know the London Eye in London, when they put that up? Does anyone remember this? When they put the London Eye up, it was new technology at the time. BA was sponsoring it, and the machine that was taking it up got stuck halfway, and it was stuck there for about 2 weeks. So typical Richard Branson, he got one of those balloons, and on the side of it it says, BA can't get it up. Which was typical of the advertising. So they had all sorts of quirky, iconic people. They had limo delivery. They had Miss Piggy. They had all sorts of people promoting the brand. And, you know, get down to some measurement. If you actually look at, just look at the top there. Consumer commitment. My first choice for flying over BA, Virgin wins. The only airline I would use, Virgin wins. Would recommend to a friend, strong affection. I like this scheduled airline more than others, so Virgin outperforms all of them. You go down below, have you used it? Would you consider it in future? You know, British Airways doesn't come out very strong on that one, I'm afraid. People who used it, they would prefer not to use it again if they can possibly avoid it. And so over here, is it worth paying extra for? You know, way above the airline average, and Virgin outperforms British Airways. The thing that puzzles me is why British Airways is so strong on that. Is it worth paying the extra? I assume that must be because the people who go on British Airways are not paying. Generally speaking, it's their companies that are paying. And they get air miles, whereas most people that are going on Virgin are paying for it themselves. Anyway, I think that's a good case study of how you use marketing and branding to leverage value, that you do measure it, and you can see an end result in financial terms. So, before I finish, and I think I now have, how long do I have? 20 minutes, isn't it? I don't want to overrun. 5? You've got to be joking. I started at 25 past. I looked at my watch. Right, anyway. I'll hold you to that. This is the last piece, which I'd like you to see now. One of the real problems is that in most organisations, marketing and finance is still not aligned. When I set brand finance up 15 years ago, I assumed that we would be part of a movement that would make it happen fairly rapidly. And yet I go around companies, and it is still true that you hardly get any communication between them. And I think these slides here, showing the stereotypical views of finance by marketing, in this case, that they're all short-term, profit-focused, bean-counting bores. And, you know, the marketing people are all subjective, creative, wacky drug takers who, you know, wouldn't know a balance sheet or a P&L if it hit them in the face. You know, those still apply with far too many companies, in my view. We also, not only do we work with the Virgin Group, we also work with a company in India called Kingfisher, which is run by a guy called Vijay Mallya, who is kind of the equivalent of Richard Branson in India. And people talk about him as though he's a sort of wacky playboy. When you meet him, he is so razor sharp. He is incredibly sharp on finance, business, money. That's why he's successful. He blends the two. And what I just want to show you here is a terribly sad case study of a brand that we know quite well. Plymouth Gin, very famous gin in the UK. It's one of the oldest. It's got a product of denominated origin. It's distilled in Plymouth. And their distillery was on the quayside, and the founding fathers of America docked right in front of where their distillery was. It goes right back that far. They gave it as the tot in the Navy. You either had rum, brandy, or gin as a sailor. You could choose. So it was extra strong, had lots of flavour with botanicals in, and all this kind of stuff. And back at the beginning of the 20th century, it got to quite a high case volume in the States, particularly as a specialist martini gin. That was doing very well. But then it got taken over by Allied Domecq, and Allied Domecq chucked it in to their gin portfolio, where they've got Beefeater and a couple of others. They put a relatively weak marketing and branding team on it, and gradually they drove it into the dust, until eventually it was only doing about 25,000 cases. And the sort of inane mistakes they made were on the product, because it wasn't doing too well, and having alcohol in makes the product more expensive. This clever brand manager decided, let's downgrade it from 46% proof to 41%, so we won't have to charge so much for it, totally taking away its differentiation that it was a strong product. They then cut the price to gain distribution and try to get into supermarkets, and of course all that leads to is you get screwed a bit more, so they had to keep dropping their price, which meant they didn't have money to invest. They chased UK supermarket sales with very low margins because it was dead easy, much easier to do that than get proper distribution. They de-emphasised the naval history and made packaging really boring. And finally, they put their most junior brand managers on it. I mean, they absolutely, you couldn't have got a better case study of how to destroy a brand in about 5 years. And so what actually happened was that after John Murphy sold off Interbrand, that's about 15 years ago, he took the proceeds and with about 3 or 4 financial acquaintances, they bought into Plymouth Gin and just reversed everything. I mean, that wasn't rocket science. They just went back and put everything back as it had been before. They upgraded the packaging, they made it more traditional, they reasserted the strength, they put back the botanicals, and lo and behold, within 3 years, they got bought out of Vin and Sprit at 20 times what they paid for it. Perfect example of, again, the blend of marketing and finance people to get things right, to turn around the money. Now finally, and I'll just take a few more minutes and then I will close. You may be unaware, or maybe you've heard of it vaguely, but I started with brand valuation at about 15, 16 years ago. When I started, it was regarded as a completely gibberish profession by finance people. I remember going into the big 4 accountancy firms where they would not take you seriously. They thought it was all black box mumbo jumbo. Over the 15 years, things have changed dramatically. Accounting standard, International Accounting Standard 3, FRS 3, in 2004 meant that you had to put value on all the intangibles to stick them in the balance sheet, which is how we got those charts at the very front of my presentation. They are now doing it. Since that point, all accountancy firms now take this seriously, and as a result, various standard-setting bodies are taking it seriously to clarify the way it's done. And the latest of these is ISO, International Standards Organization, 150 members, took 3 years. I was the chairman for the UK on the working party, produced this thing. It's about clarity, transparency in the way these things are done. It only came out in September last year, but will, I think, dramatically change finance people's view about the whole area of these assets and the value of brands. And so it's trying to create a universal standard across all territories to make it transparent and reproducible, to ensure that the analysis, all relevant analysis is included in the valuation, and that it's done in an independent and sensible way. And so there is now a certification process for brand valuations. Pleased to say, Brand Finance is certified. There are a variety of other companies that are. You don't necessarily have to use an external consultant to do it, though. You can do it internally, as long as you follow the standard. And I strongly recommend that you do. what you are expected to do is a detailed legal analysis to cover those issues that I mentioned about ownership of the IP that sits underneath all this value. Secondly, a behavioural analysis that allows you to fully understand why the stakeholder groups are doing what they're doing, or as best as possible understand and have a pretty good hunch of where your future forecasts are going. Then you roll that into your financial forecasts, which justify values, which justify investment decisions, and so on. And they recommend, generally there are three broad approaches to valuation. You can look at what it costs you to make it, you can look at what the market might pay, or you can look at income. In the case of brands, there is no free market. What it costs is not really a good measure, so everyone uses income. Income is the right approach. In other words, what income will it generate into the future? If you are trying to put a value just on the trademarks, the package of trademarks, the standard recommends a number of different approaches. You can look at price premium, but generally that's quite difficult, and I think it's spurious whether it really reflects the value of a brand. You can look at economic substitution, where you say if we didn't have this brand, we use a different brand, what difference would it make to the value of the branded business? That type of valuation, I believe, is the right valuation to use for marketing people. You look at your business model, say if we change this or change that, what difference would it make to the overall value of the business? The bottom one is the one that is used by accountants for those snapshot valuations just to put a balance sheet figure in on an acquisition. It's a point-in-time valuation which is useful and reliable, but it's very static. The one that is most used for marketing people is economic substitution. So for example, we did some work with Vodafone where we looked at one of their subsidiaries, branded something else. If we put Vodafone on that subsidiary, what would happen to the performance of the business? We did a lot of market research, analysis, looked at the market, gave our view, said the value will either, well, I think said the value would increase, but the question is by how much, and is it worth investing to do that? So that sort of substitution analysis, or we've got a business, if we take this brand off it and put another brand on it, what difference will we make? And that is what we use for scenario analysis and brand portfolio reviews and brand architecture. So amongst the options that were given by ISO, economic substitution, in my view, is the way to go if you were doing commercial valuations. If you were doing highly technical valuations for your balance sheet, you use the bottom one. And just so you know how that works, what you do, it's relatively simple. You take the future forecast revenues, you apply a royalty that someone might charge you if you didn't own your brand and you were borrowing it from someone else, like Virgin. So let's say it's 5% of your turnover. You take off a tax charge and you discount it back to a net present value, a classic investment analyst's way of valuing any asset. It applies equally to trademarks and brands. And that is the number that goes into a balance sheet when an acquisition happens. And I was asked to put that in because the next two speakers are going to briefly talk about the application of some of this, and so they'll be referring to it in Estonian, so maybe they'll elaborate anything you didn't understand from what I've said. But basically you're looking at cash flows, a strip of which belongs to the brand, and you define it by the royalty you could charge. Here is a calculation. So you're looking at net revenues, taking off a notional royalty charge. You can see the brand earnings are what the royalty would be. You take tax off, and then you discount it for each year into the future, and you take it to perpetuity. And it gives you a capital value for that brand. Now, within brand finance, we would do those kind of valuations for technical purposes. We would also do economic substitution valuations where you want some brand strategy application, an internal application. And in order to do that, you need to understand all the research, you need to understand how the business works. You do that brand valuation, and then you're in a position to do scenario analysis, to do dashboards, and to do dynamic modeling to decide how could I improve the value of my brand. One of the key issues being you must do it on a segmented basis in order to get a full understanding of where the value is being added and not added. In some cases you find one segment is destroying value, another segment is adding value. So it's got to be segmented. And when you've got that, you can have a dashboard that allows you to see in this particular market against this particular segment, we have high share, we're spending a lot of money on marketing, is it really producing the return in value terms? Should we switch some of our money to somewhere else? So you can see it in a framework to make sensible decisions about allocation of budgets. And I will end with this slide, which basically is a snapshot royalty relief valuation that we do annually of the top brands in the world. And you can see there that the highest value brand as far as we were concerned, and that is defined as the trademarks done on a royalty relief basis. So if you were to put them in the balance sheet, Walmart would be worth 41 billion, beg your pardon. Coke, according to us, would be 34 billion. Now, these are just technical valuations you'd expect an accountant to produce. The ones that you use for really intelligent analysis are economic substitution. But they are still extremely important, because if you can show a number like that to your finance director about your brand, demonstrate that it is a big asset, you are much more likely to get cooperation, to run them in a way where you get greater say, where you're able to treat them like businesses and business assets. Historically, marketing people have not been able to do that. And now I think we're in a whole new world where you are able to do that. But in order to do it well, you need to collaborate with your finance colleagues. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks.